What's going on, Guardians? It's Tizzle here, and in this video, I want to go over why Warlord's Ruin is the best dungeon Bungie has ever made. To put it simply, it is a culmination of all the best things the previous dungeons have offered, all rolled into one. Bungie has learned a lot from their previous 7 dungeons, and in my opinion, it takes the things that were the most well received in those dungeons and incorporates it all into one package here. So let me elaborate on what I mean by that. So first of all, I want to say that whenever a new dungeon comes out, there's always a lot of hype and it is fun for your first few times through. So I wanted to wait a few days to run it back numerous times and beat it on Master and such before I made a definitive conclusion on it. But I can certainly say that I will like this dungeon more than the previous 2 installments that we've gotten. The first dungeon to come into the game was the Shattered Throne in the Dreaming City way back in 2018. Back then, it was actually a challenge, but by today's standard, thanks to power creep, it is quite easy. The dungeons that followed were Pit of Heresy, Prophecy, Grasp of Avarice, Duality, Spire the Watcher, and Ghosts of the Deep. All have had different combat encounters and traversal sections to make a solo flawless a somewhat challenging experience, so let's break down why Warlord's Ruin does it better than any of those other ones. The very first thing for me is pacing. I said this in our day 1 clear, it was paced perfectly. The opening encounter can be reached in under a minute when you know where you're going. And unlike previous dungeons, it opens up with a boss encounter. This dungeon has 3 bosses rather than 2 bosses in an ad clear encounter that we've become accustomed to lately. This was a nice change of pace, but for me, it is the pace that you get to these encounters that is so awesome. A dungeon that does this horribly is Ghosts of the Deep. The aesthetic and boss encounters in that dungeon are great, but the pacing sucks. The first encounter should be 3 loops, not 4, and the traversal from encounter 1 to 2 is so fucking long and boring that I actually hate running that dungeon because it just feels so slow. Again, the aesthetic and underwater environment are super cool, but it is needlessly long and dragged out. If I could start that dungeon at Ekthar and then do the quick traversal to Samuma and then fight her and be done, I would love that dungeon way more. Compare that with Warlord's Ruin. On the first clear, you have to go through the maze and you don't know where you're going, so there's a sense of exploration as you try and find your way out of the maze. But on subsequent runs, you can get a route down and know where you're going, and this will speed up your runs in the future. We'll touch on this aspect a little later on in the video, but what this does is it provides a skill gap to your future runs. If you learn your way through the maze, you can drastically speed them up. This is nice because as you run the dungeon more, you can be quicker and more efficient. Contrast this with the traversal in Ghosts of the Deep. It is almost impossible to speed up the traversal between the first and second counter, which makes repeat run-throughs a boring slog, because there is no sense of exploration anymore. You just want to hurry through the water and get it over with, but you can't. Whereas in the maze, you can rip through it when you learn the route and where the traps are. And speaking of traps, that brings me to another feature that they have implemented in this dungeon, this time stealing from Grasp of Avarice, the booby traps. Grasp was so much fun in the first run through because you were trying all these switches and getting killed. It makes for hilarious moments. I also ran through Grasp with some real life friends and it was their first time, so it was a lot of fun for me to watch them try and learn their way through the dungeon while I just sat back and laughed as they got killed. So this is great for your first clear and for running new players through because it is very entertaining. But then like I said, if you're just going for a quick clear with your friends, then you know where the traps are and can avoid them. I really like the addition of these. The falling snow from the cliffs and crumbling rocks in the Taken Rock room are nice touches too. So this was another example of an element from a previous dungeon that was beloved that they brought back here in Warlord's Ruin. And the jail puzzle was also a nice touch. Puzzles are always fun to figure out, even if you only get to do it once and then on future clears you will be in and out in no time. So next is the biggest one for me, and this one is kind of a 2-parter. So we'll start with the first part, which is getting to damage phase. Again, this is where the pacing is absolutely excellent in this dungeon. In Ghosts of the Deep, particularly solo, it takes way too long to get to damage phase on the final boss. And then thanks to the overshield, when you are solo, this fight can take many phases, so it just feels super long and boring. Again, it should take a little longer to get to damage as a solo, obviously, but there isn't much you can do in Ghosts of the Deep to speed it up. Whereas in something like Spire the Watcher, when you learn where to shoot all the nodes, you can drastically speed up getting to damage. In this dungeon, the mechanics have a ton of agency. Let's look at the Ogre boss. You have to kill those Scorned Chieftains and capture their totems, but if you kill them too fast, then you don't get the second totem. I'm not a huge fan of this personally, because I like to be efficient. However, it actually makes a bit of sense when I think about it. They are a high value target, so should be a bit of a threat. So rather than being allowed to kill them immediately, you have to leave them up and play around them and wait for the totem to spawn. This is smart design as it forces you to make a choice. eliminate the threat so you don't die to it, or wait for it to spawn the totem and then kill it. But while it is alive, you have a risk of dying. The skill gap here is being able to time it so you can kill the chieftain just as it spawns the totem. This allows you to capture both totems quickly. Some of the best solo players in the world are able to kill both in one cycle, though for most solos you will capture 2 totems at most, meaning you can dunk 2 fireballs and then have to shoot the blight eyes again to spawn in the chieftains again and do it one more time. But in a fire team, you can do 2 and 2, so you only need 1 cycle. What this means is you have agency. The more proficient you get at the encounter, the more it can be sped up. You can get the timing down and be into damage in less than 3 minutes, which is absolutely awesome. But if you don't capture all the totems, you'll have to do it again. This is perfect encounter design. It rewards you for your mastery. Let's contrast this with the final boss. We have the same scenario. If you can only manage to capture 1 totem, you will only get 7 seconds of boss damage. Get 2 totems, it's like 12 seconds, and 3 totems is 14 or 15 seconds. So again, you are rewarded for mastery. Solo, it is very tough to capture more than 2, but good fire teams should be getting 3 totems every time. This means you have to go through less damage cycles overall, and that is the most threatening part of the boss fight, actually getting to damage. So the less you have to get to damage, the better. So again, you are rewarded for mastery, and that feels great. I love that, because it feels worth it to do the best that you can because it will speed up the dungeon in a meaningful way. The Harpy boss on Spire the Watcher is pretty much the only boss where you can extend your damage window, but that is just by hitting a damage threshold. However, Duality does this quite well. You have to hit the bells to damage Keitel, and even the Galron fight, there is a skill gap to getting the most out of your damage window there, by killing the projections as fast as possible. And you can also do the little Scion glitch to also extend your timer. Again, this feels great. Where with Keitel, it is more of a punishment if you don't do the bells properly, but with Warlord's Ruin, it doesn't feel as punishing because you can get to the next phase much quicker than Keitel. This makes it feel rewarding, where in Duality, it feels more punishing to miss a damage phase. I guess the Shattered Throne final boss also has that to a degree. You have to kill the 3 knights within the same window to get the finite times 3 buff. This isn't an extension, but it buffs your damage. This feels nice, to have agency over your damage phase. And what this allows for, like I have said, is mastery of the encounter. Prophecy has long been my favorite dungeon because like Warlord's Ruin, you have agency in the final boss fight. There is a skill gap there. When you learn the movement of the final boss, you can do incredible damage because you can be set up for your damage window. Be ready for it to teleport, and the boss will stay on the platform longer if you are damaging it. If you don't deal damage, it will warp quicker. Prophecy has long been the best dungeon boss fight in the history of the franchise thanks to this skill gap, and that is where this dungeon gets it so right. On the Ogre boss, you can light the flames in any order you choose. This is great. Again, I keep saying this, but having agency is wonderful. It allows for skill expression, or for many different damage strategies to work. Samuma in Ghost of the Deep is a slog to damage phase and then just 45 seconds of damage. Rinse, repeat. Many bosses are like this. The Grasp of Avarice bosses, same thing. But Warlord's Ruin gives agency. The other thing I like is the segmentation of the damage phases. It isn't just unload all your weapons at once. Again, that is boring. You're actually incentivized to pick between high DPS and high total damage loadouts, as well as burst damage options, because you have to get your damage out in like a 12-second window. But in the Ogre fight, you do that 4 times in a row. So if you just have burst DPS, your last couple damage phases you could be out of ammo. But if you just go for sustained damage, your damage won't be great. So there are trade-offs. Same goes for the final boss. I love this setup because it offers us DPS strats that are more unconventional than the typical unload all your ammo and hope you have a 1 phase that we are used to in raids and dungeons. Again, Prophecy got this very right, and I haven't seen it done well since this dungeon. I also like the downtime between DPS phases. If you need to farm ammo, you are able to do that. On Ogre Boss and the Chimera, you have to shoot the Blight Eyes to progress the encounter. But if you need ammo, you can shoot enemies over and over and leave 1 Blight Eye up until you are ready. I love this. I love that I can DPS on my own terms when I am good and ready. More of this, please, Bungie. Next, we have the Traversal. This is pretty subjective, but it is great in this dungeon. You have to kill adds at various points, which is pretty typical. There's a bit of a jumping skill gap required. You have bait chests hidden throughout, and the environment changes. Some of the traversal is on cliffside, some is in caves, and some is in mazes. So even if the traversal sections are long, they don't feel long. And that is the key difference. They don't feel boring and annoying to run through. feels like you are always moving thanks to the change in environment, and that is an important distinction. Next, aesthetic. Again, this is subjective, and credit where it's due, Bungie nails it here always. All the dungeons fit a certain theme, aside from maybe Spire the Watcher, but that could just be because the Vex are boring. But yeah, the aesthetic in this dungeon is super cool. I absolutely love it. But I usually love the aesthetics, so there's nothing new here. And lastly, we have the mechanics. The mechanics can kill you, but they aren't super punishing. I think the time limits to hit the bells and stuff in Duality were the most unforgiving of all the wipe mechanics in the dungeons. I think it was probably a little too difficult, like for the average player, but the wipe mechanics in this are threatening enough, but you don't feel under too much pressure. They will only really kill you if you aren't paying attention, but they are fair and always your fault. You don't really die to bullshit like you do in some other dungeons. The spike traps in the first encounter are neat as hell. They can kill you if you aren't on point shooting yourself out. The second encounter, the biting cold, it is easy to get to a flame to clear the debuff, but if you aren't paying attention, then you will die. And on the final boss, the Scorn guys that are punching you, again, are a fair mechanic. You just have to punch them and then get away from them if you don't want to die. So yeah, I really like the wipe mechanics in this dungeon as well. And lastly, we have what they have been doing recently where you do certain triumphs like solo flawless and then you get a better chance for the exotic to drop. This is a great change as RNG can be a fickle thing. Additionally, they incentivize repeat run-throughs by adding a quest that allows you to unlock hidden doors throughout the dungeon. This incentivizes exploration to find all the secrets hidden within the mountainside. As well, it encourages you to play through it again and again. But as great as the dungeon is, many players still want an incentive to running it, and this gives you a tangible reason to do so. And for all those reasons, that is why Warlord's Ruin is the best dungeon Bungie has ever made. Let me know down in the comments how you feel about the new dungeon, and if you are still here, then thanks so much for watching to the end. Take care.